Harry Potter sat in the cold, echoing courtroom of the Wisengamot, his wrists bound in magical restraints. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained still, unreadable. The air buzzed with whispers, a sea of robed witches and wizards glaring down at him from their seats. Harry James Potter, intoned Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic, his voice laced with barely hidden satisfaction. You stand accused of the murder of Cedric Diggory, conspiracy with he who must not be named, and the use of unforgivable curses. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Harry clenched his fists, the injustice of it all making his blood boil. He had tried to explain, tried to tell them that Voldemort had returned, that Cedric had been murdered by Peter Pettigrew under Voldemort's orders. But no one wanted to listen. Dumbledore had fought for him, but even the great Albus Dumbledore's influence wasn't enough to sway the Ministry's iron grip on the truth. I didn't kill Cedric, Harry said firmly, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. Voldemort is back. He killed Cedric. He used me to return to life. A murmur of unease spread through the Wisengamot at the Dark Lord's name, but Fudge only scoffed. Enough of this nonsense, Potter. We have testimonies, reliable ones, stating you were the only one seen returning with Diggory's body. We have evidence that you used the Cruciatus Curse on a Death Eater in the graveyard. And now, you speak of you-know-who as if he truly returned. Harry gritted his teeth. He did return. Fudge ignored him. The evidence is overwhelming. The court has deliberated, and the verdict is clear. He turned to the assembled judges. All those in favor of conviction? One by one, hands rose. Some hesitated, but under the pressure of the Ministry's fear-mongering, they joined the majority. Harry turned his head, searching for someone, anyone, who would stand up for him. Hermione sat in the gallery, tears in her eyes. Ron looked pale and sick but couldn't meet his gaze. Dumbledore's expression was unreadable. Fudge gave a satisfied nod. Then, by the authority of the Wisengamot, Harry James Potter is hereby sentenced to life imprisonment in Azkaban. A stunned silence filled the room before whispers erupted into full-blown shouting. No! Hermione's voice rang out, breaking through the noise. This isn't right. He's innocent. Silence! Fudge snapped, banging his gavel. Take him away! Harry barely had time to register the betrayal, the fear, the crushing weight of his fate before the Dementors arrived. The room grew colder as the cloaked creatures glided forward, their skeletal fingers gripping his arms. A chill seeped into his bones, and the world began to blur. As the Dementors led him away, he heard a voice, faint, desperate. I swear, Harry, Hermione whispered, we'll get you out. But as the heavy doors of the courtroom slammed shut behind him, he wasn't sure if he believed her. The moment Harry stepped into Azkaban, the air itself seemed to turn against him. The icy winds of the North Sea howled through the prison's stone corridors, and the walls, damp with centuries of suffering, loomed over him like a tomb. The Dementors didn't hesitate. They dragged him through the main gates without ceremony, their very presence sucking the warmth from his body, leaving only an aching void. Harry barely flinched as they forced him forward. He had already endured their touch before, during his third year, in the graveyard where Voldemort had returned, and again in the courtroom when his fate had been sealed. But this was different. There was no one here to cast a Patronus, no Dumbledore to defy the Ministry, no Sirius to pull him onto a hippogriff and fly him to freedom. He was alone. The iron bars of his cell slammed shut behind him, sealing his fate. The sound echoed, final and cruel. Harry barely had time to glance around before the Dementors left, leaving him shivering in the darkness. The cell was small, barely enough space for a thin, rotting mattress and a chamber pot in the corner. The walls were covered in scratches, desperate marks left by those who had wasted away before him. He slumped against the cold stone, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He told himself he wouldn't break. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. But already, the voices were creeping in. Cedric is dead because of you. You could have saved him. Sirius will die too. And it'll be your fault. Harry clenched his jaw, trying to shut them out. He wouldn't let the Dementors win. He had survived worse. But the days dragged on, blurring into weeks. Azkaban had no windows, no way to tell time beyond the distant screams of prisoners who had long since lost their minds. The Dementors passed by his cell often, lingering just long enough to leach away whatever memories of warmth he had left. He tried to hold on to the good ones. The way Hermione's face lit up when she solved a difficult spell. Ron's terrible chess strategies. Mrs. Weasley fussing over him at the burrow. But even those were starting to fade, replaced by darker, more painful memories. The graveyard. The look in Cedric's eyes as the killing curse struck him. The cold laughter of Voldemort. The betrayal in Ron's face when Harry had been dragged away. One day, if it was even day, Harry sat in the farthest corner of his cell, knees drawn to his chest, barely feeling the hunger gnawing at his stomach anymore. The Dementors were near, but something was different. This time, he heard a voice. Potter. His head snapped up. The voice was rough, almost amused. Harry turned, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, and through the bars of the cell across from him, he saw a man sitting lazily against the wall. His face was thin, gaunt from years in Azkaban, but there was something sharp in his expression, something familiar. You're the last person I expected to see here, the man said, tilting his head. The great Harry Potter. The chosen one. Locked up like the rest of us. Harry stared at him, his mind sluggish from the weight of Azkaban. Then recognition hit him like a bludger. Antonin Dolohov. A Death Eater. One of Voldemort's most loyal followers. A man who had fought in the Department of Mysteries. A man who had nearly killed Hermione. Dolohov grinned, showing yellowed teeth. Word travels fast, even in here. The Ministry thinks you're one of us now, huh? Can't say I blame them. Harry's fingers curled into fists, but he said nothing. Dolohov chuckled. Don't look at me like that, Potter. You'll find that Azkaban has a way of making enemies into allies. If you want to survive, you'll need friends. Even the right kind of friends. Harry didn't respond, but deep down, a horrifying realization settled over him. If he wanted to survive Azkaban, he might have to play the game. Harry sat motionless against the stone wall, his body numb from the cold. His mind, however, burned with the weight of Dolohov's words. You'll need friends. Even the right kind of friends. The idea disgusted him. He would rather rot than ally himself with a Death Eater. But deep down a small, gnawing thought whispered, how long before I break? Dolohov leaned against the bars of his cell, watching Harry with lazy amusement. You'll learn soon enough, Potter. Azkaban doesn't care who you were out there. Only who you are in here. Harry didn't reply, but he felt the truth in Dolohov's words. Days or weeks passed in a slow, suffocating haze. The routine was brutal. A guard would shove a bowl of foul, watery gruel through the bars twice a day. Sometimes the Dementors would hover outside his cell for hours, waiting, feeding. There was no warmth, no light, no sense of time. Just the endless void of despair. Harry tried to hold on to his memories, his sense of self. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Cedric's body. He heard Voldemort's laughter. He saw Ron and Hermione watching helplessly as he was dragged away. The weight of it all threatened to consume him. Then one day a fight broke out. It started with shouting from a few cells down, guttural, angry voices. The guards usually ignored these things, letting the prisoners tear into each other like wild animals. But this time, Harry heard movement, metal clanking against stone, followed by a loud crash. A prisoner had forced his way out of his cell. Harry barely had time to react before the fight reached his corridor. A hulking figure, bald with a jagged scar across his face, stormed past, shoving another prisoner to the ground. The victim groaned, blood pooling beneath his broken nose. The attacker turned, scanning the cells. His wild eyes landed on Harry. He grinned. Well, well, he drawled, stepping closer. The boy who lived. Never thought I'd see you here. Harry stared at him warily. He didn't recognize this man, but the way he moved, the sheer bulk of his frame. He was dangerous. The prisoner leaned against the bars of Harry's cell, sneering. Never liked you, Potter. Too much fame. Too much luck. Wonder how long that'll last in here. Dolohov chuckled from across the corridor. Careful, Jugsun. Potter might surprise you. Harry's stomach turned. Jugsun. Another Death Eater. Someone who had fought against the Order of the Phoenix. Jugsun grinned wider. You hear that, Potter? He thinks you're a fighter. But me? He reached through the bars, grabbing Harry's collar. I think you're just a scared little boy. Something inside Harry snapped. He moved before he could think, grabbing Jugsun's wrist, twisting it hard until there was a sickening crack. Jugson howled, jerking back, but Harry didn't stop. He slammed his fist into Jugson's face through the bars, feeling the crunch of cartilage beneath his knuckles. Jugson staggered back, clutching his broken nose. "You little—" "Enough," Dolohov interrupted. There was no amusement in his voice anymore. "He's made his point." Jugson glared at Harry, breathing hard. But he didn't attack again. He wiped the blood from his face, spat at the ground, and walked away. Harry's hands trembled as he sat back down. He expected fear, guilt, something. But all he felt was a cold, hard satisfaction. Across the corridor, Dolohov laughed. "Not bad, Potter. Not bad at all." Harry didn't respond. He just stared at his bloodied knuckles, realizing the truth. Azkaban was changing him, and he didn't know if he could stop it. Harry sat in the darkness of his cell, his hands still sore from the fight with Jugson. The bruises on his knuckles throbbed, but he barely felt the pain. He was still replaying the moment in his mind. The raw force of his punch, the sickening crunch of breaking bone, the way the rage had surged through him like fire. He should have felt disgusted with himself. But he didn't. Across from him, Dolohov chuckled. "I knew you had it in you, Potter. Took you long enough." Harry didn't respond. He wasn't about to make conversation with a Death Eater, even if Dolohov seemed disturbingly entertained by his situation. Dolohov sighed, shifting against the wall. "You're learning the first rule of Azkaban. You don't get to be who you were before. Out there, you were the chosen one, the hero. But in here," he smirked, "you're just another prisoner. And if you want to stay alive, you'll have to play by different rules." Harry glared at him. "I'm not like you." Dolohov raised an eyebrow. "Aren't you?" His eyes flicked to Harry's bruised knuckles. "Because from where I'm sitting, you did exactly what we do. You saw weakness, and you crushed it." Harry clenched his fists, but Dolohov just laughed. "Relax, Potter. I'm not here to recruit you. I'm just saying, you can't survive Azkaban by clinging to who you were. You have to become something else." Harry turned away, staring at the damp stone wall. He hated Dolohov's words because deep down, a part of him feared they were true. The days passed in a blur of monotony. The same slop for meals, the same freezing cell, the same endless darkness. But Harry wasn't the same. He could feel it. The longer he stayed in Azkaban, the more the lines between right and wrong blurred. One night, the Dementors lingered outside his cell for longer than usual. He tried to fight it, tried to hold on to something good, but his happiest memories were slipping away. His parents, Ron, Hermione, Quidditch, Hogwarts. It all felt distant, like something that had happened to someone else. And then the nightmare came. He was back in the graveyard. Cedric's lifeless body lay on the ground. Voldemort's cold voice echoed through the darkness. "Kill the spare." But this time, when he looked down, it wasn't Cedric. It was Ron, and Harry was the one holding the wand. He woke up with a sharp breath, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The cold of the cell was nothing compared to the ice creeping into his veins. Dolohov's voice cut through the silence. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" Harry swallowed hard. Thinking about what? How easy it would be. Dolohov leaned forward, his dark eyes glinting in the dim light. How easy it would be to stop fighting it. To let Azkaban make you into what you need to be. No more rules, no more burdens. Just survival. Harry said nothing, because for the first time, he wasn't sure if he disagreed. Harry had lost track of time. Whether it had been weeks or months, he couldn't tell. Azkaban existed outside of time, a place where day and night had no meaning. The only constant was the suffocating cold, the endless hunger, and the creeping presence of the Dementors. He had thought he was strong. He had thought he could hold on to himself. But the longer he remained in this prison, the more his mind twisted in on itself. Sleep was a luxury he no longer possessed. Every time he closed his eyes, the nightmares came. Sometimes it was Cedric dying again and again. Sometimes it was Sirius, falling through the veil while Harry stood frozen, unable to move. And sometimes it was different. Sometimes he wasn't the victim in his nightmares. He was the executioner. The Dementors had done their job well. His happiest memories had faded to distant echoes. He could barely remember the warmth of the burrow, the sound of Hermione's laughter, or the feel of a broomstick beneath him. But the anger, the darkness, that had remained. And it was growing. The other prisoners had noticed. He could hear them whispering when they thought he wasn't listening. Some feared him. Others watched him with curiosity, waiting to see what he would become. Dolohov was the worst. "You feel it, don't you?" the Death Eater murmured one day, his voice almost soothing. "The anger. The power. It's waking up inside you, Potter." Harry ignored him. He had learned early on that engaging Dolohov only encouraged him. But Dolohov wasn't wrong. The breaking point came when the guards dragged in a new prisoner. It wasn't unusual. The cells of Azkaban always had new arrivals, some screaming, some silent in their defeat. But this time, Harry recognized the man being shoved into the cell across from him. Stan Shunpike. The same Stan Shunpike who had been arrested for allegedly working with the Death Eaters. The same Stan who had been nothing more than a foolish night bus conductor caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Harry had been angry when the Ministry first arrested him. Now, seeing him in Azkaban, thin and shaking with fear, that anger turned into something else. Something dangerous. Stan looked around, his eyes darting wildly before they landed on Harry. "P. Potter?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Blimey, it really is you." Harry didn't respond at first. He wasn't sure what to say. They threw me in here, mate. Said I was a Death Eater." Stan gave a weak, humorless chuckle. "Can you believe that?" Yes, Harry could. The Ministry didn't care about truth. It never had. Stan swallowed hard. "They won't let me go, will they?" Harry met his eyes, and for the first time, he truly understood. No one was coming to save them. Not him. Not Stan. They were nothing more than ghosts, rotting away in a place the world had already forgotten. A slow, simmering fury built inside him. He had spent so long drowning in despair and guilt. But now, something different was taking hold. He wasn't going to die here. He wasn't going to let Azkaban win. Dolohov was watching him closely, as if he could sense the shift. "Good," he murmured, a twisted smile curling his lips. "Now you understand." Harry clenched his fists. He hated Dolohov. He hated everything he stood for. But for the first time, Harry wasn't sure if he hated the lesson he had just learned. He needed to stop surviving. He needed to start fighting. Harry sat in the dim, freezing cell, his mind sharper than it had been in weeks. No, months. He was sure now, it had been months since he was thrown into Azkaban. Time had worn him down, had tried to break him. But instead of falling apart, something inside him had hardened. The Harry Potter who had entered Azkaban was not the same one who sat here now. He had learned the first rule of this place: despair is death. The moment you give up, the Dementors feast on what's left of you. He had come close, far too close, but something had changed when he saw Stan Shunpike locked away in this hellhole. Injustice. That was what burned inside him now. The Ministry had put an innocent man in Azkaban. They put me here. And that meant one thing. The Ministry didn't care about truth. Harry's breath was steady as he leaned his head against the cold stone wall. He had spent so long thinking that the world outside still followed the same rules, that if he just held on, someone would fix this. Dumbledore. The Order. Hermione and Ron. But no one had come. And now he knew why. No one was coming. The realization didn't break him. It fueled him. If he wanted to get out, he would have to make it happen himself. Azkaban wasn't inescapable. Sirius had proved that. And if Sirius had done it alone, without a wand, without help, then Harry could do it too. He needed a plan. Dolohov's voice interrupted his thoughts. "You're thinking about escape, aren't you?" Harry didn't move. He didn't answer. Dolohov chuckled. "Took you long enough. Tell me, Potter, do you actually believe you can break out of Azkaban?" Harry turned his head slightly, just enough to meet Dolohov's gaze. "You sound like you've thought about it too." Dolohov smirked. "Oh, I have. Plenty of times. Problem is, this place is designed to keep us weak. No wands. No food. No hope." He tilted his head. "But you're different. You still have something left." Harry narrowed his eyes. "What do you want, Dolohov?" Dolohov leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "An opportunity. And maybe, just maybe, I can help you." Harry didn't trust him. He would never trust a Death Eater. But if Dolohov had information, something that could help him get out, he needed to be smart. So he gave a slow nod. "Then start talking." Dolohov grinned. "Now we're getting somewhere. Harry wasn't naive. He knew Dolohov had his own agenda. But none of that mattered right now. Because for the first time since he arrived in Azkaban, Harry wasn't thinking about if he could escape. He was thinking about how. Dolohov leaned back against the damp stone wall, his smirk never fading. He had seen Harry's shift. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was planning. That was dangerous. And intriguing. "You've been here long enough to know the obvious, Potter," Dolohov said, his voice low. "Azkaban isn't just a prison. It's a slow execution. The Dementors don't let anyone die quickly. They let you rot, let you forget who you were until there's nothing left but an empty shell." He tilted his head. "But that's not your fate, is it?" Harry kept his expression blank. He wasn't going to play Dolohov's game. "You know something," Harry said. "Something useful." Dolohov chuckled. "Of course I do. I know things the Ministry would rather I forget." He tapped his temple. "They think throwing people in Azkaban makes them disappear. But some of us remember. Some of us listen." Harry's fingers curled into his palms. "Then tell me." Dolohov let the silence stretch before finally answering. "Azkaban's walls weren't built for security. They were built for fear. Do you know what the real weakness of this prison is?" Harry frowned. "No." Dolohov's grin widened. "The prisoners." Harry's stomach twisted. He had assumed any escape would have to be done alone. But Dolohov was suggesting something different, a revolt. "I'm not starting a war," Harry said firmly. Dolohov shrugged. "You won't have to. The war is already brewing. You just need to choose whether you want to be a part of it." Harry exhaled sharply. He had seen how the prisoners looked at him. Some with fear, others with curiosity. Many of them had been Death Eaters, but not all. Some had been thrown here without trial, like Stan. They all had one thing in common. They wanted out. Harry's mind was racing. If he could find the ones who weren't loyal to Voldemort, the ones who had been abandoned by the Ministry, he could build something. A distraction, an opening, a chance. Dolohov watched him closely. "I'm not saying we shake hands and become best mates, Potter. But in here, survival is about alliances." His grin turned sharp. "And you might find that the people you once called enemies? They hate the Ministry just as much as you do." Harry felt the weight of the words settle on him. Was he willing to do this? Was he willing to trust anyone in this place? His gaze flickered across the darkened cells. Stan, thin and pale, barely clinging on. Other prisoners, watching from the shadows, waiting for something, for someone, to do what no one else had done before. Maybe Dolohov was right. Maybe Harry didn't need to escape alone. Maybe he needed an army. Harry lay awake in his cell, staring at the damp ceiling as whispers of his own thoughts curled around him. His old self would have never considered working with people like Dolohov. His old self would have believed in justice, in the system, in waiting for help to come. But his old self was gone. Azkaban had burned that version of him away. He needed to act. But he had to be careful. He couldn't trust anyone outright, especially not a Death Eater. If he made the wrong move, it wouldn't just be his life on the line. It would be anyone who dared to follow him. He needed to find the ones who wanted out. The ones who had nothing to lose. 2 days passed before Harry spoke again. He waited for the perfect moment. When the Dementors were drifting further down the corridor, when the guards were growing lazy from routine. Then he turned his head toward Stan Shunpike's cell. "Stan." Stan barely reacted at first. His eyes were sunken, his face pale. He had been here too long. But after a few seconds, he slowly turned his head. "You want out of here?" Harry asked, his voice low. Stan swallowed hard, then gave a weak nod. Harry shifted his gaze. A few cells down, a frail-looking man with shaggy hair and hollow eyes was listening. Not a Death Eater, but someone who had been forgotten, just like Stan. And further down, there were more. Dolohov had been right. Azkaban was full of people the Ministry had discarded. And discarded people? They were dangerous. Dolohov chuckled from the shadows. "Interesting, isn't it? How quickly you've taken to this game." Harry ignored him. He kept his voice steady low. "We can't fight the Dementors. But the guards, they're human. They make mistakes." A small sound came from another cell. A chuckle. "Potter's got a death wish," a gruff voice muttered. "But hell, so do the rest of us." Harry turned his head. Slowly, more faces were emerging from the dark, more eyes watching him. The first spark had been lit. Now he just needed to turn it into a fire. Harry had spent years leading people, first at Hogwarts with Dumbledore's army, then in the war against Voldemort. But this was different. These weren't friends. These weren't students. These were prisoners. Some were here for crimes they never committed. Others, they had earned their place in Azkaban. And yet they all had one thing in common. They wanted out. Stan was the first to whisper back. You really think we can escape? His voice was barely more than a breath, laced with fear and something else, hope. Harry didn't hesitate. I know we can. A few prisoners scoffed from the shadows. Yeah, and how exactly do you plan to fight the Dementors, Potter? One of them sneered. Harry's jaw tightened. We don't fight them. We outsmart them. Dolohov chuckled from his cell. Now you're speaking my language. Harry ignored him. He didn't trust Dolohov, but he wasn't about to throw away an opportunity. The Death Eater knew things about Azkaban that Harry didn't. He might be dangerous, but right now, knowledge was more valuable than trust. Tell me about the guards, Harry said, keeping his voice low. They're patrols. They're shifts. There has to be a weakness. Dolohov smirked. Oh, there's plenty. But the real question is, how do I know you won't throw me to the wolves the second we step outside? Harry met his gaze without flinching. Because I don't care about you, Dolohov. I care about getting out. For a moment, the two locked eyes, a silent battle of wills. Then Dolohov laughed. Well, maybe Azkaban is finally making a man out of you, Potter. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. The Dementors don't guard the prison. They keep us weak. The real guards? They're ministry wizards. And like all ministry wizards, they're lazy, arrogant, and overconfident. Harry frowned. How many of them? Depends on the shift. Sometimes 5. Sometimes 10. Dolohov shrugged. Most of the time, they stick together, drinking themselves into a stupor between rounds. Harry's mind was racing. 5 to 10 wizards. They had wands. The prisoners didn't. That was a problem. But if the guards were complacent, then maybe, just maybe, they could catch them off guard. Harry turned back to the others. We don't need to fight them all. We just need to take down 1 or 2. Take their wands. Create a distraction. A heavy silence filled the corridor. Then, the gruff voice from before spoke again. You're serious? Harry nodded. Completely. For the first time in weeks, something flickered in the dark, a shift. The prisoners weren't just listening anymore. They were considering it. Dolohov grinned. Looks like you might actually start a riot, Potter. Harry's grip tightened on the cold iron bars. Not a riot, he muttered. A revolution. Harry knew that planning an escape wasn't enough. He had to make the first move. Azkaban was full of lost causes, men and women who had given up, who had accepted their fate. They had spent years, some even decades, watching their minds rot away. But now they were watching him, and he needed to prove that this wasn't just talk. Dolohov had given him the first real piece of information. The guards were lazy, overconfident. That was their weakness. But weaknesses meant nothing unless they were exploited. So Harry waited. He watched. He counted the steps of the patrols, measured the time between their rounds, memorized everything. Days passed. Maybe weeks. It didn't matter anymore. Time wasn't real in Azkaban. Not when the Dementors sucked the meaning out of it. Then finally the moment arrived. A guard, one of the younger ones, barely older than Harry, walked past his cell alone, yawning into his hand. That was the mistake. The others were still at their post, too far to hear anything. Too far to react. Harry moved fast. He lunged forward, slamming into the bars with every bit of strength he had left, screaming at the top of his lungs. Help! He's dying! The young guard flinched, nearly dropping his wand. He turned, frowning. What? He can't breathe. Harry roared, his voice raw, desperate. Please. It was a gamble. But it worked. The guard hesitated, then cursed under his breath and took a step forward. That was all Harry needed. A hand shot out from the next cell, thin, wiry fingers wrapping around the guard's collar. Stan. Before the guard could react, Stan yanked him against the bars with a sickening crack. His head slammed into the iron, his wand tumbling from his grip. Harry snatched at midair. A stunned silence filled the corridor. Harry had a wand. For the first time since he entered Azkaban, power surged through his veins. The The guard groaned, dazed, blood dripping from his forehead. He reached weakly for his belt, probably to summon help. Harry didn't hesitate. Stupefied, the red jet of light slammed into the guard's chest, knocking him unconscious. Then chaos erupted. Prisoners screamed, some in excitement, others in shock. Chains rattled, voices rose in desperation. "Potter's got a wand," someone howled. "He's really doing it." Harry's breath was ragged, his heart pounding. This was it. The first move had been made, and Azkaban would never be the same again. For a moment, everything was frozen. The guard lay unconscious, the wand warm in Harry's grip, and the prisoners stared. Some in shock, some in hope, some in hunger. Then chaos erupted. "Get us out, Potter!" A man roared from the darkness. "You've got a bloody wand, use it." Harry's mind raced. One wand wasn't enough. They needed more. More wands meant more fighters, more control, more chances. But first he had to move fast. If the other guards caught on, asterisk asterisk if they sounded the alarm, asterisk asterisk this would all be over before it even began. His grip tightened. "No, not today. Stand back up," he ordered. Without waiting, he pointed the wand at the cell door. Alhamra. The lock clicked. The door swung open. Stan gasped, stepping forward like he didn't believe it. He was free. One wand. One prisoner freed. That wasn't enough. Harry turned, scanning the cells. He couldn't free everyone, not yet. He had to be smart. He needed people who would fight, people who wouldn't slow him down. His eyes landed on Dolohov. The Death Eater smirked, hands resting casually on the bars. "Well, you going to let me out, Potter? Or are we still pretending you're too noble to work with the likes of me?" Harry's stomach twisted. He hated Dolohov. He had fought against him in the war. But right now? Right now, he needed allies. He flicked his wand. Alhamra. The door swung open. Dolohov stepped out, stretching as though he had just woken from a nap. "Wise choice." "We're not friends," Harry snapped. "You follow my lead, or I leave you behind." Dolohov chuckled. "Of course, Captain Potter." Harry turned to the next cell. The gruff man who had spoken before, the one who had believed in the plan. His name was Avery. Not the Death Eater Avery, but another prisoner, one who had been thrown in Azkaban without trial. Harry freed him too. And then another. And another. The whispers spread through the prison like wildfire. Potter was breaking out, and he was taking others with him. But just as Harry reached for the next lock, a siren blared. The other guards had realized. Harry's stomach dropped. They were out of time. Dolohov grinned, rolling his shoulders. "Looks like we'll have to fight after all." Harry gritted his teeth, gripping the wand tighter. "Then let's make it count." The battle for Azkaban had begun. The blaring sirens sent a ripple of panic through the prison. Dementors stirred in the distance, their ominous presence sending a wave of cold through the corridors. Heavy boots pounded against stone. The guards were coming. Harry's grip tightened on the stolen wand. He had seconds before they arrived. "Stan, grab the guard's belt," he ordered. "He's got backup wands." Stan snapped out of his daze and scrambled to the unconscious guard, fumbling with the leather strap. His hands shook, but he managed to pull free 2 extra wands. He tossed one to Avery, the other to Dolohov. Dolohov caught his with a smirk. "Now we're talking." Footsteps rounded the corner. 3 guards, wands raised, faces furious. "Down!" Harry shouted. He dived to the side as a stunner blasted past him, slamming into the iron bars. Sparks flew. Dolohov was faster. Expelliarmus. One of the guards was flung backward, his wand flying into the air. Avery lunged, grabbing it mid-spin. Harry spun, firing his own spell. Stupefy. The second guard collapsed instantly. The third hesitated, just for a second, before turning to run. He never got the chance. Dolohov flicked his wand. Incarcerus. Thick ropes lashed around the guard's body, pinning his arms to his sides. He hit the ground hard, struggling uselessly. Harry turned to Stan. "Search them for keys." Stan hesitated but nodded. He knelt, rummaging through the guard's robes with shaking hands. A second later, he pulled out a ring of iron keys. Harry snatched them. This was it. He ran to the nearest cell and shoved a key into the lock. A loud click. The door swung open. The prisoner inside, a woman with matted hair and a scarred face, stumbled forward, staring at the open door as if she couldn't believe it. "You want out?" Harry asked. She nodded once. "Then fight." He tossed her one of the stolen wands. The prisoners roared in approval. Harry turned to the others. "We take the guards down one by one. We free the ones who will fight. We move fast before the Dementors get here." More cells opened. More wands were passed around. The numbers were shifting. The guards had controlled Azkaban for decades. But now? Now the prisoners outnumbered them. Dolohov grinned. "You're really going through with this, aren't you?" Harry didn't look at him. His eyes were set on the stairwell ahead, on the path to freedom. "Watch me." Then, with wands raised, they charged. The sound of rushing footsteps echoed through the prison as Harry led the charge. The freed prisoners stormed down the corridor, their wands clutched in white-knuckled grips, their ragged breaths mixing with the tension that thickened the air. Harry barely had time to register the panic in the guards' eyes before the first spells were fired. Stupefy! A blast of red light slammed into the nearest guard, sending him crashing into the wall. Another guard raised his wand, but Dolohov was faster. Cruck! Expelliarmus! Harry cut him off, his spell knocking Dolohov's wand away before he could finish the unforgivable curse. Dolohov whirled on him, furious. "I told you," Harry growled. "No killing. No torture." Dolohov sneered but said nothing. He simply retrieved his wand and turned back to the fight. Spells flashed through the corridor. Blue and red light clashed, illuminating the crumbling walls of Azkaban. A prisoner screamed as a stunning spell hit him square in the chest, sending him flying backward. "Get up!" Harry shouted. "We keep moving." Stan ducked behind Harry, barely avoiding a curse. "We need more wands. More fighters." Harry's eyes snapped to a corridor lined with more cells. The guards had too many reinforcements. If they were going to win, they needed numbers. "Cover me," he ordered. Harry darted to the first locked cell and jammed a key into the rusted iron. With a loud click, the door swung open, revealing a wild-haired man with sunken eyes. He blinked at Harry in confusion. "Can you fight?" Harry demanded. The man's lips stretched into a grin. "Oh, I thought you'd never ask." Harry tossed him a wand. One by one, more cells opened. More prisoners joined the fray. The hallway filled with shouting, with the crackling of spells, with the unmistakable shift of power. The prisoners were winning. The guards were retreating. Then, a wave of ice-cold air rushed through the hall. The prisoners froze. Their breath became visible, curling in the dim torchlight. A deep, dreadful emptiness settled in Harry's chest. No, the Dementors had arrived. A dozen of them floated at the end of the corridor, their tattered cloaks billowing like liquid shadows. Their hollow, rotting mouths opened, and they began to feed. A horrifying scream rang out as one prisoner collapsed, clutching his head, his memories being torn away. Another dropped his wand, falling to his knees in a silent sob. The battle halted. Harry staggered, his vision blurring. The memories came like an avalanche. Sirius falling through the veil. Dumbledore's lifeless body. The screams of war. He felt his knees buckle. No, no, not like this. Through the haze of despair, Harry forced himself to move. He gripped his wand, shaking, his breath ragged. Expecto. His throat tightened. He could barely focus. The Dementors loomed closer, their rattling breath filling his ears. No one else knew the spell. If he failed now, they were all dead. Harry clenched his jaw. He thought of his friends. Ron, Hermione, Ginny. He thought of the Weasleys' warm kitchen, of laughter, of sunlight. Of the fact that he wasn't done fighting. His hands steadied. Expecto Patronum. A blinding silver stag erupted from his wand, its antlers slashing through the dark. The Dementors screeched, recoiling as the Patronus charged. The wave of despair broke, like sunlight piercing through a storm. The prisoners gasped, pulling themselves back together. Harry stood tall, his Patronus guarding them. His chest heaved, but his eyes burned with determination. "We're not done yet," he growled. And with that, they pressed forward. The silver stag charged forward, its brilliance cutting through the darkness like a sword. The Dementors shrieked, retreating into the shadows, their skeletal hands clawing at the air as they fled. Harry's breath came in sharp gasps. His vision swam, but he held onto his Patronus, forcing it forward, pushing the cold away. "We need to move," he shouted. Before they come back, the prisoners snapped out of their trance. Some looked at Harry with awe, others with newfound determination. The battle wasn't over, not yet. Avery wiped sweat from his brow. We need to take the high ground. The guards are still controlling the upper levels. Harry's mind raced. He was right. The main exit was on the upper floors. And if the guards still held that position, they could trap them inside. Stan bolted to Harry's side, his face pale. I heard one of the guards say something about reinforcements. Ministry Aurors are on their way. A sick feeling settled in Harry's stomach. If the Aurors arrived while they were still inside, they'd be outnumbered. They had to move fast. We take the tower, Harry said. And we do it now. A ripple of agreement spread through the prisoners. Harry turned, leading the charge. They raced up the stone staircase, their footsteps echoing through the halls. The air smelled of damp stone and fear, but Harry didn't slow down. Every second counted. As they neared the top, shouts rang out. They're coming up. A volley of spells rained down. Protego! Harry roared, throwing up a shield as red and blue curses slammed against the invisible barrier. Take cover! Avery bellowed. Prisoners pressed against the walls, dodging spells as a dozen guards stood at the top of the stairs, blocking their path. We need to break through, Stan yelled. Dolohov grinned. I've got an idea. Before Harry could stop him, Dolohov flicked his wand. Depulso! A massive force blasted forward, slamming into the guards like a tidal wave. They were flung backwards, colliding with walls and railings, their wands spinning out of reach. The way was clear. Harry shot Dolohov a sharp look, but there was no time to argue. Go! They rushed forward. At the top of the stairs, the guards lay groaning on the stone floor. Harry grabbed the nearest wand and tossed it to a prisoner. The battle wasn't over yet. A deep rumbling filled the air. Harry froze. The walls shook. The torches flickered. And from the far end of the tower, a low, menacing voice rumbled. Potter! The air turned to ice. Harry's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. Kingsley Shacklebolt, Minister for Magic. And he wasn't alone. With a flash of green light, Aurors appeared. Cloaked figures stepped forward, wands raised. Their eyes were cold, unforgiving. They had arrived. And now, there was nowhere left to run. Harry's grip on his wand tightened. His heart pounded as Kingsley Shacklebolt stepped forward, his deep-set eyes locked onto Harry with a mixture of disappointment and resolve. The Aurors surrounding him fanned out, forming an impenetrable wall of wands. Harry Potter, Kingsley said, his voice calm but unyielding. Stand down. The prisoners shifted uneasily. Some were still gripping their wands, others looking to Harry for guidance. Even Dolohov, usually eager for a fight, hesitated. These weren't just guards, these were Aurors. Highly trained, highly skilled, and fully prepared to end this rebellion by force. Harry's mind raced. He had come so far. They all had. He couldn't just surrender. You don't understand, Harry called out, meeting Kingsley's gaze. They left me here to rot. Without trial. Without justice. Kingsley's face didn't change. We do not negotiate with criminals, Harry. A prisoner beside him scoffed. Oh, that's rich, coming from the ministry. How many of us got a fair trial? Kingsley ignored him. His eyes never left Harry. We can still fix this, but you need to put down your wand. Now, Harry could feel the weight of every gaze on him. The prisoners, the Aurors, even the guards. Waiting. Watching. But before he could speak, Dolohov moved. Avada Kedavra. Expelliarmus. Harry's spell struck first. Dolohov's wand was ripped from his hand before the killing curse could even form. He turned, face contorted in rage. What are you doing? Dolohov bellowed. Harry rounded on him. I said no killing. Dolohov sneered. You're weak, Potter. If you think the ministry will show mercy, you're a fool. He lunged for his wand. Stupefy. Dolohov collapsed, unconscious. The Aurors tensed. Wands flicked upward. Harry raised his hands. I don't want a war. His voice was firm. But I won't let you lock us back up without justice. A long silence. Then Kingsley exhaled. You've put me in a difficult position, Harry. I know. Kingsley glanced at the unconscious Dolohov, at the freed prisoners behind Harry, at the Aurors waiting for a command. His jaw tightened. Then, in a low voice, he said, Give me the wands. I'll hear you out. The prisoners stirred. Avery muttered, he's bluffing. Stan looked to Harry. We can't go back, mate. Harry's heart hammered. This was it. The final choice. Fight or surrender. His fingers curled around his wand. His breath shaky. Then he made his decision. And the next moment, everything changed. Harry's wand felt heavier than ever before. His fingers tightened around it as he met Kingsley's unwavering gaze. The freed prisoners behind him muttered in uncertainty, waiting for his decision. Avery stepped closer. Harry, if we give up now, we're done. They'll lock us up for life, or worse. Stan shook his head. Maybe they'll listen. Kingsley's not like the rest of them. Harry's thoughts raced. He had seen how the ministry worked. Even now, even with Kingsley in charge, corruption still ran deep. If he surrendered, there was no guarantee they'd be treated fairly. But if he fought, the Aurors wouldn't hold back. Harry's jaw clenched. He had never feared a fight. But this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone behind him. People who had suffered, people who had lost everything. They deserved justice. Harry took a slow breath, then did something no one expected. He lowered his wand. Gasps rippled through the prisoners. Avery cursed under his breath. Stan looked relieved. Kingsley, however, remained unreadable. Harry tossed his wand forward. It hit the cold stone floor with a sharp clatter. Take me in, Harry said. But only if you swear, on your life, Kingsley, that everyone here gets a fair trial. No more hidden sentences. No more throwing people into Azkaban to rot without proof. Silence fell over the room. Kingsley studied him for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice like thunder in the quiet. Done. A murmur went through the Aurors. A few prisoners still held onto their wands, hesitant. But then, one by one, they followed Harry's lead. Wands hit the floor. Even Avery, his face twisted in frustration, finally gave in. Kingsley gestured to his Aurors. Bind their hands. No Dementors, no torture. They come back to the ministry for questioning. Proper questioning. The Aurors moved in, securing the prisoners with magical restraints. Some of the prisoners snarled. Others bowed their heads in silence. When they reached Harry, he felt the cold metal clamp around his wrists, but he didn't fight. He had made his choice. Kingsley stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Harry could hear. You made the right call, he murmured. Harry's jaw tightened. We'll see. Because deep down he knew. The fight wasn't over yet. And soon the real war would begin. The cold metal of the restraints bit into Harry's wrists as he and the others were marched out of Azkaban. The once distant horizon of the North Sea was now real, stretching before them in an endless expanse of storm-gray water. The wind howled, but it was nothing compared to the storm raging inside Harry's mind. This was only the beginning. The Aurors forced them into enchanted boats, which glided silently across the water. No one spoke, not Kingsley, not the Aurors, not the prisoners. Harry kept his gaze fixed ahead, his expression unreadable. As the ministry's towering structure loomed in the distance, his gut twisted. He had walked into this building so many times before, as a hero, as a soldier, as a savior. But today, he was a prisoner. The second they arrived, dozens of eyes turned to him. Aurors, ministry officials, even reporters. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Is that really Harry Potter? He's in chains. Merlin's beard, what did he do? Harry ignored them. The prisoners were led through the grand corridors, but Harry was separated. Two Aurors flanked him, their wands subtly drawn, as they took him to a familiar chamber. The Wizengamot courtroom. The same place where, as a teenager, he had stood alone before a sea of judges, accused of using magic in the Muggle world. But back then, Dumbledore had been there. Now, Harry was on his own. The chains wrapped around the chair slithered and tightened, locking him in place. He refused to flinch. The massive doors creaked open. The Wizengamot members filed in, their purple robes billowing. Kingsley took his place at the center, but his face gave nothing away. The room was packed, not just with officials, but Aurors, journalists, even some of his old allies. Among them, he spotted Hermione. Her face was pale, her hands clenched in her lap. But when their eyes met, her expression flickered. Not with anger, not with judgment, but with something else. Desperation. Hope. Harry forced himself to look away. Kingsley stood, his deep voice booming across the room. This court is now in session for the trial of Harry James Potter. Silence. Then, an elderly witch with a sharp gaze leaned forward. The charges are as follows: leading a prison riot, aiding and abetting criminals, attacking ministry personnel, and resisting arrest. How do you plead? Harry's fists clenched. He could feel the weight of everyone's stares pressing down on him, waiting for his answer. He lifted his chin. Not guilty. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Kingsley's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened slightly on the podium. The trial had begun, and Harry wasn't backing down. Harry's voice echoed through the grand chamber, his words clear and defiant. Not guilty. The murmurs in the Wizengamot grew louder. Some looked scandalized, others furious. Only a handful remained neutral. Kingsley's expression remained unreadable as he raised a hand, signaling for silence. Very well, said a thin, sharp-faced wizard sitting to Kingsley's right. His nameplate read Bartholomew Cuff, head of magical law enforcement. His voice was cold and clipped. You claim innocence, Mr. Potter, yet the evidence against you is overwhelming. Harry didn't blink. Then let's hear it. Cuff smirked and lifted a piece of parchment. Witness testimonies from multiple Aurors confirm that you led a violent rebellion inside Azkaban. You broke out dangerous criminals and attacked ministry officials in the process. Do you deny this? Harry's jaw tightened. I fought for my survival. I fought for people who had no trial, who were thrown into Azkaban without proof of their crimes. A woman with silver hair, sitting further down the bench, scoffed. So you admit to freeing prisoners? Harry's temper flared. I admit to freeing people who deserve justice. Do any of you even know how many of them were innocent? How many were thrown in there because the ministry needed a scapegoat? The murmurs grew louder. Cuff leaned forward. And what about Antonin Dolohov? His voice was sharp as a knife. One of the most notorious Death Eaters? Do you consider him innocent too? Harry's stomach twisted. Dolohov, the man who had killed countless people. The man Harry himself had fought in battle. Cuff's smirk deepened. You see, Mr. Potter, the problem is that your little rebellion didn't just free the innocent. It freed monsters. And now they're gone, vanished into the shadows. Perhaps you would like to explain where they are. Harry's hands clenched into fists. He didn't know where Dolohov and the others had gone after Kingsley had taken him in. They had disappeared into the night. And the truth was, he wouldn't have stopped them. I don't know, he said finally. But that's not my responsibility. The ministry let those people rot in Azkaban without fair trials. If some of them were innocent, that's on you. Gasps filled the chamber. A few Wizengamot members whispered among themselves. Cuff's eyes gleamed. And what of the guilty? He asked. Would you have let them go free? Harry hesitated. He had fought so hard for justice, but he had never considered what would happen next. Did his actions make him just as reckless as the ministry? Before he could answer, a new voice cut through the tension. Enough of this. Harry's heart lurched. Hermione. She stood up from the spectators' seats, ignoring the guards who tried to stop her. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with determination. You're twisting his words, she said, her voice steady. You're making him sound like a traitor when all he wanted was fairness. But let's not forget, this is Harry Potter, the boy who saved all of you. And now you're treating him like a common criminal. A murmur rippled through the Wizengamot. Some looked uncomfortable. Others, like Cuff, looked annoyed. Kingsley sighed. Miss Granger, you are not a member of this court. No, she interrupted. But I am a witness. Kingsley's brow furrowed. To what? Hermione turned to Harry, her expression unreadable. Then she looked back at the Wizengamot. To the real corruption in this ministry, she said. Silence. Then uproar. The court had just turned into a battlefield. The courtroom erupted. Judges, Aurors, and ministry officials all spoke at once, their voices clashing in a storm of outrage and disbelief. Some demanded Hermione be removed immediately, others shouted accusations. Miss Granger, you are out of line. Bartholomew Cuff's voice boomed over the chaos. You have no authority here. Hermione didn't flinch. She stood her ground. No, but I have the truth, she said sharply. And that should mean something, even in a place like this. Kingsley raised a hand, and slowly, the voices in the chamber died down. His gaze flickered between Hermione and Harry before he finally spoke. You claim to have proof of corruption, Miss Granger, he said carefully. Then speak, but be very sure of what you're about to say. Hermione's fingers tightened around the papers she held. She took a slow breath, then lifted her gaze to the Wizengamot. I've spent the last 3 months digging through ministry records, she began. At first, I was trying to find out how many prisoners in Azkaban were never given a fair trial. But what I found was much worse. A ripple of tension moved through the court. Hermione's eyes locked onto Cuff. Since the war ended, your department has sentenced over 200 people to Azkaban without trial. She held up the parchment. And it's all here. Names, dates, charges, most of them vague or completely fabricated. A stunned silence fell over the Wizengamot. Even Kingsley looked unsettled. Harry's heart hammered. He had suspected this, but hearing it out loud, seeing the proof, was something else entirely. Cuff's face darkened. That's a serious accusation, Miss Granger. It's not an accusation, she shot back. It's a fact. She flipped to another parchment. And do you know who signed off on these arrests? Her voice hardened. You, Mr. Cuff. And at least half the people sitting in this room. The murmurs turned into shouts. Several Wizengamot members turned to each other, arguing in hushed but frantic voices. Others looked directly at Kingsley, waiting for his reaction. Kingsley's expression was unreadable, but Harry saw the tension in his shoulders. You're lying, Cuff spat, his face twisted with anger. This is ridiculous. The ministry was at war. We had to take precautions. Precautions? Hermione echoed, her voice fierce. You locked people away for life without evidence, without even allowing them to speak in their defense. She took another step forward, slamming the parchment down onto the judge's table. Including Harry. Silence. Kingsley's fingers tapped against the wooden podium. His jaw tightened. This is troubling, he admitted at last. His deep voice carried through the room, cutting through the lingering tension. If these documents are real, then we have a serious problem within the ministry. Cuff whirled toward him. Surely you're not believing this nonsense? Kingsley's expression was hard. I believe in evidence. Cuff's lips curled into a sneer. You're weak, Kingsley. Always have been. You think these people deserve a chance? You think Potter deserves a chance? His eyes flickered to Harry, filled with pure contempt. After everything you've done, Potter, do you really think you're the hero here? Cuff spat. You released criminals into the world. You attacked Aurors. You've disgraced yourself. Harry finally spoke. And what about you? He asked, his voice cold, steady. How many innocent people have you locked up for your own gain? How many families have you destroyed? Cuff's sneer vanished. You don't know anything. I know enough. Harry's gaze didn't waver. You wanted control. You wanted power. And you used the fear left after the war to take it. The courtroom was silent. Then Kingsley stood up. This trial is no longer about just Harry Potter, he announced. His deep voice carried the weight of authority. If what Miss Granger says is true, then there are others who must answer for their actions. He turned to the Auror standing guard. Take Bartholomew Cuff into custody. He will face a full investigation. Cuff's face twisted in fury. You can't be serious. The Auror stepped forward. Don't touch me, he snarled, reaching for his wand. Expelliarmus. Kingsley's wand flicked, and Cuff's wand shot out of his grip. He stumbled back, face red with rage, as the Aurors grabbed him. The courtroom erupted once again. But this time it was different. For the first time in a long time, Harry saw change. Kingsley turned back to Harry. The trial isn't over, he said. But you won't be the only one answering for what's been done. And for the first time since his arrest, Harry felt hope. The courtroom was still buzzing with tension long after Bartholomew Cuff had been dragged away. The sudden turn of events had shaken the Wizengamot. Some members whispered among themselves, clearly troubled. Others still glared at Harry, unwilling to shift their stance even in the face of overwhelming evidence. Harry remained standing in the center of the chamber, watching them all. He could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. But for the first time in months, he wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting for justice. Kingsley exhaled and adjusted his robes. We will take a brief recess, he announced. This trial has taken an unexpected turn, and decisions must be made carefully. The Wizengamot will reconvene in 1 hour. With a wave of his hand, the chamber began to empty. The judges left first, some looking shaken, others coldly neutral. Orrs escorted Cuff out through a side door, and a few officials trailed behind Kingsley, speaking in hushed tones. Harry felt a hand on his arm. He turned to see Hermione. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice quiet. He nodded, but the truth was he didn't know. Things had shifted in his favor, but he wasn't free yet. There were still too many uncertainties. "That was reckless," he told her, though there was no anger in his voice. Hermione huffed. "Oh, and you breaking out of Azkaban wasn't." He smirked despite himself. "Fair point." Ron approached, his face still a little pale from watching the courtroom explode into chaos. "Blimey, mate. That was intense." "You think?" Harry muttered. Ron gave a small shake of his head. "I don't trust them, though. Some of them still want you gone. Just because Cuff was corrupt doesn't mean they'll clear you." Harry sighed. He knew that. Kingsley might be fair, but others weren't. Some still saw him as a threat. Hermione tightened her grip on his arm. "Then we don't stop fighting." He glanced at her, seeing the fire in her eyes. Ron nodded. "Right. No way we let them pin this on you." Harry exhaled, feeling something settle inside him. He wasn't alone in this. But he also wasn't naive. The fight wasn't over. An hour later, the chamber was full once more. Harry stood in the center again, his heart steady. Kingsley raised a hand for silence. "The Wizengamot has deliberated," he announced. His deep voice echoed through the courtroom, heavy with authority. "We have taken into account the accusations against Mr. Potter, the evidence presented, and the wrongdoings uncovered within our own system." A few members shifted uncomfortably. "And?" Harry asked, keeping his voice even. Kingsley looked at him directly. "The verdict will now be delivered." Silence. The moment Harry had been waiting for was here. He held his breath and waited. The silence in the courtroom was unbearable. Harry stood still, his breath controlled, his heartbeat pounding in his ears as he watched Kingsley's expression. The minister's face was calm, unreadable, but his eyes held the weight of the decision that was about to be spoken. "The Wizengamot," Kingsley began, his voice firm, "has reached a decision regarding Harry Potter's fate." The tension in the air thickened. Harry barely blinked. He felt Hermione and Ron standing just behind him, their presence a silent reassurance. Around the chamber, the members of the Wizengamot remained rigid, their faces a mixture of hesitation, determination, and in some cases, lingering resentment. Kingsley continued. "Considering the circumstances of his imprisonment, the unjust actions taken by the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and the lack of due process in his original sentencing." He paused. Harry clenched his fists. "The charges against Harry Potter are hereby dismissed." The words hit him like a thunderclap. For a moment, Harry couldn't move, couldn't react. His brain struggled to process what had just happened. Dismissed. The trial was over. He was free. A loud gasp came from somewhere in the chamber, followed by whispers, then the unmistakable roar of voices as the courtroom exploded into reaction. Some of the Wizengamot members looked furious, while others nodded grimly, as if they had expected this. Harry's body felt light. After months of chains, of Azkaban's crushing despair, of fighting just to breathe without guilt, it was over. A hand grabbed his arm, Hermione. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. "Harry," she whispered, almost as if she didn't believe it either. Ron broke the silence first. "Yes," he bellowed, throwing his arms up, his voice echoing through the chamber. "I told you lot he was innocent." Hermione let out a laugh, half disbelief, half relief, before throwing her arms around Harry. "You did it," she whispered, her voice shaky. Harry barely managed to lift his arms to hug her back. His body was still processing the words. The chains around his wrists had been gone for some time, but now, for the first time in months, he actually felt free. Kingsley raised a hand, signaling for silence. The room settled, but the energy was still electric. "This case," Kingsley continued, "has exposed significant flaws within our justice system. As minister, I will ensure that an official investigation is conducted. Corruption, wrongful imprisonment, and abuses of power will no longer be tolerated in this ministry." His eyes swept over the room, and a few Wizengamot members shifted uncomfortably. "However," Kingsley went on, turning his attention back to Harry, "there is still one matter to address." Harry stiffened. The murmurs in the room quieted as the weight of Kingsley's words settled over everyone. Harry wasn't sure what he expected next, but then Kingsley's gaze hardened. "Harry Potter," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Though you were wrongfully imprisoned, you have also acted outside the law. Your escape from Azkaban, your attacks on Aurors, and your defiance of Ministry authority, all of these cannot be ignored." The air shifted. Harry felt the relief and his chest turned to stone. Of course. Of course it couldn't be that simple. "You will not be returned to Azkaban," Kingsley clarified, "but you are not above the law either." A few voices in the chamber murmured in agreement. Some still didn't want him free. Some wanted him punished. Harry's fists clenched. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice steady. Kingsley exhaled. "You will not walk away from this without consequences." Hermione's grip on his arm tightened. Ron's face darkened. Harry nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "So what happens now?" Kingsley's next words would determine everything. Harry didn't flinch. He met Kingsley's gaze head-on, refusing to show fear. He had fought too hard, endured too much, to be brought down by a vague consequence. The courtroom remained silent, every pair of eyes locked onto the exchange. Kingsley's face was unreadable, but his next words struck like a hammer. "You are sentenced to a period of service under the Ministry's supervision," he announced. "For the next year, you will work as an Auror in training under direct observation. Your movements will be monitored, and you will report regularly to the Wizengamot. Any violation of the law will result in immediate imprisonment." The room shifted. Harry inhaled slowly. No Azkaban. No chains. But still not free. An Auror in training? Under supervision? It was a leash, carefully disguised as an opportunity. Harry's jaw tightened. "That's ridiculous," Ron muttered beside him. "He's not some criminal who needs watching." "Actually," Hermione cut in, eyes sharp, "this might be the best outcome we could have hoped for." Harry shot her a look, but she gave him the smallest nod. "Think about it," she whispered. "This keeps you out of prison, lets you rebuild your life, and," her voice dropped even lower, "puts you inside the Ministry, where you can watch them just as closely as they're watching you." Harry's stomach twisted. She was right. It wasn't just a punishment. It was a strategic move. Kingsley, watching them carefully, cleared his throat. "Do you accept these terms, Harry?" Harry turned back to him, measuring his words. Did he have a choice? Not really. Refusing would mean pushing his luck too far. But more than that, Hermione was right. This was a way back in. A way to change things from within. Harry took a slow breath. "I accept," he said, voice steady. A ripple of whispers moved through the courtroom. Some people nodded approvingly. Others still looked unsatisfied, like they'd wanted a harsher fate for him. But Harry didn't care. Kingsley nodded. "Then it is decided. Harry Potter will serve 1 year under Ministry supervision as an Auror in training. This trial is now officially concluded." A loud bang echoed through the chamber as he struck his gavel. It was done. As soon as the chamber began to clear, Hermione turned to Harry, her face full of barely contained urgency. "This is good," she insisted. "You can use this, Harry. You'll have access to Ministry information. You'll be able to—" "Hermione," Ron interrupted, rubbing his temples. "Can we just take a second to breathe?" Harry let out a small breath, feeling the weight of everything pressed down on him. He wasn't in Azkaban anymore. But this fight wasn't over. Not even close. 1 year, Harry muttered, mostly to himself. 1 year of being watched. 1 year of playing by their rules. Ron clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Then we make sure you survive it." Hermione smiled, but her eyes held determination. "No, we make sure you do more than just survive." Harry didn't know what the next year would bring. But he wasn't done fighting yet. The world outside the Ministry felt different. Harry had expected relief when he stepped out of the courtroom. But instead, he felt like he was still trapped. The chains were gone, but the Ministry's eyes were now everywhere. Kingsley had given him freedom with conditions, and Harry knew the Ministry would be watching his every move, waiting for him to slip up. The streets of London were bustling, but Harry barely noticed. He, Ron, and Hermione walked in silence, their steps heavy as they made their way toward Grimmauld Place. The moment they stepped inside, Ron exhaled loudly, flopping onto the couch. "Well, that was mental." Hermione crossed her arms. "It could have been worse, Ron." Ron shot her a look. Could it, though? He's got Oris babysitting him for a year. Harry ignored them both, moving toward the window. The street outside was quiet, but he had a feeling it wouldn't be for long. I need to be careful, Harry murmured. The ministry might have cleared me, but that doesn't mean they trust me. Hermione nodded, already lost in thought. We need to find out who's in charge of your supervision. The ministry won't want you digging too deep, but you have a unique opportunity now. Ron groaned. Come on, Hermione. Can we take a break before we start the spy games? She rolled her eyes. Ron, Harry is basically a prisoner on probation. Do you really think the ministry is just going to let him live his life normally? As if on cue, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Harry's stomach dropped. Ron and Hermione froze. Slowly, Harry stepped toward the door. He had barely been out of the courtroom an hour. Who was already looking for him? He pulled the door open. Standing on the doorstep was a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp blue eyes and an expression that made it clear he wasn't here for pleasantries. His dark robes were crisp, an aura badge pinned to his chest. Harry Potter, the man said, his voice cool and professional. Harry's grip on the door tightened. Yeah, the aura stepped forward. I'm Adrian Greaves, your new supervisor. Silence. Hermione stiffened beside Harry, and Ron muttered, bloody hell. Greaves didn't smile. You start tomorrow. Report to the ministry at dawn. Don't be late. Then, without waiting for a response, he turned and vanished. Harry stared after him, feeling the weight of his new reality. His year under ministry watch had just begun, and something told him it wasn't going to be easy. The next morning, Harry arrived at the ministry just as the clock struck dawn. He had barely slept, his mind racing with everything that had happened in the past few weeks. He was free, but not really. Stepping into the Auror office, he immediately felt the shift in atmosphere. People turned to look at him, some with curiosity, others with skepticism. He wasn't just any new recruit. He was the Harry Potter, the ex-Azkaban prisoner now forced into the system. At the far end of the room, Adrian Greaves stood with his arms crossed. The moment he saw Harry, he jerked his head toward an open training area. You're late. Harry frowned. I'm here exactly on time. Greaves didn't blink. Which means you should have been here 5 minutes earlier. You want to prove you belong here, Potter? Then you follow my rules. Understood. Harry gritted his teeth. Understood. The day started with brutal drills. Hand-to-hand combat. Duels. Spell casting under pressure. Greaves threw Harry into the deep end, pushing him harder than the others. Every spell he cast was scrutinized, every move questioned. Too slow. Greaves barked as Harry barely dodged a stunning spell. You're used to fighting like a hero. Out here, that'll get you killed. Harry's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He just threw himself back into the fight, refusing to give Greaves the satisfaction of seeing him struggle. By midday, he was covered in bruises, breathing heavily as he slumped against a wall. Across from him, a few Aurors in training whispered to each other, occasionally glancing at him. Bet he doesn't last a month. He's only here because of politics, not because he deserves it. Harry exhaled sharply, forcing himself to ignore them. He had been through worse. Greaves approached, tossing him a bottle of water. Listen, Potter, he said, his voice quieter but still firm. I don't care who you are. If you want to survive this, you do what I say. If you don't, you're going to regret it. Harry took the water, meeting Greaves' eyes. I've survived worse, he said. Greaves smirked. Then prove it. As the day ended, Harry left the ministry, exhausted but determined. This wasn't just about survival. It was about proving he was more than what they thought he was. And he wasn't about to fail. Harry's body ached as he stepped into Grimmauld Place, shutting the door behind him. He hadn't been this sore since his first year of Quidditch training. But today wasn't just about physical exhaustion. It was the whispers, the stares, the doubt hanging over him like a storm cloud. Ron looked up from the kitchen table, shoving a plate of food toward him. You look like you got hit by a herd of hippogriffs. Harry grunted, dropping into a chair. Feels like it too. Hermione sat across from him, her face a mix of concern and curiosity. How was it? Harry took a bite before answering. Brutal. Greaves isn't letting up. The others don't trust me. And the ministry is just waiting for me to mess up. Hermione leaned in, lowering her voice. Did you notice anything suspicious? Harry paused. That had been on his mind all day. Greaves was tough but fair. The real problem wasn't him. It was the way certain Aurors had watched him. Like they weren't just suspicious of him, but also afraid of what he might find. There's something going on, he admitted. I don't know what, but I can feel it. Hermione nodded. The Ministry has been too quiet since the war ended. And with you under their watch, they might be hiding something bigger. Ron frowned. So what? You think they set Harry up just to keep him close? Harry shook his head. No, but they're definitely using this as an opportunity to control me. Hermione tapped her fingers against the table, lost in thought. You need to keep your eyes open, Harry. If there's something happening inside the Ministry, you might be the only one who can uncover it. Harry exhaled, pushing his plate away. He had survived Azkaban. He had survived Voldemort. Now he had to survive the Ministry. And something told him this was only the beginning. The next morning, Harry walked into the Auror department with a strange sense of unease. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they had grown worse. Today, however, Greaves didn't throw him into training. Instead, the seasoned Auror approached with a sealed envelope in hand. Change of plans, Greaves said, handing it over. You've got an assignment. Harry frowned. What kind of assignment? Greaves' expression was unreadable. Something off the books. Consider it a test. Harry opened the envelope, scanning the parchment inside. Surveillance. He was supposed to tail a Ministry official, someone named Edgar Selwyn. The name sent a chill down his spine. Selwyn had been loosely connected to the Death Eaters, but after the war, he had managed to avoid Azkaban. Why me? Harry asked. Greaves folded his arms. Because no one in the Ministry trusts you yet. If you mess up, they'll throw you back into Azkaban without a second thought. But if you do this right, you might earn yourself a bit of freedom. Harry clenched his jaw. It was a game, one he had no choice but to play. That night, he found himself in Nocturne Alley, concealed beneath his invisibility cloak. Selwyn sat in a dimly lit tavern, speaking in hushed tones to a hooded figure. Harry edged closer, his heart pounding. We have to act soon, Selwyn murmured. If Potter starts digging, everything we worked for could come undone. Harry's blood ran cold. They were watching him too. He barely had time to process the information before the hooded figure turned directly toward him. A wand flicked through the air. Hominum revelio. A jolt of magic hit Harry's cloak, and suddenly he was visible. Selwyn's eyes widened in horror. Potter! Harry had no time to think. He spun, drawing his wand, just as a curse blasted toward him. He dodged, knocking over a table as spells flew through the air. He had been caught, and now he had to fight his way out before the Ministry's secrets swallowed him whole. Harry barely had time to react. Spells crackled through the air, shattering furniture and sending splinters flying as he dove behind an overturned table. Selwyn was already barking orders. Don't let him leave. The hooded figure moved fast, sending a stupefy straight at Harry. He deflected it just in time, rolling to his feet. He needed to get out. If the Ministry found out he was snooping where he wasn't supposed to, they wouldn't care that he had been sent to watch Selwyn. They'd use it against him. Harry sent a powerful expulso at the ground, blasting dust and debris into the air. The distraction was enough. He sprinted toward the exit, dodging another hex. But just as he reached the door, a cold voice stopped him in his tracks. You really should have stayed in Azkaban, Potter. A tall, masked wizard blocked his path. Before Harry could react, a powerful spell slammed into his chest. His body went rigid. Petrificus totalis. Harry collapsed, unable to move as Selwyn and the hooded figure loomed over him. Selwyn crouched down, sneering. You don't even know what you've walked into, do you? Harry's mind raced. Who is this figure? Why were they watching him? The hooded man leaned down, whispering. You'll find out soon enough. Then darkness. Pain. That was the first thing Harry felt as consciousness returned. A dull throbbing in his head, the stiffness in his limbs. He tried to move but realized his hands were bound. He was in a dark, damp room, the air thick with the scent of dust and stone. Not the Ministry. Not Azkaban. Somewhere else entirely. A lantern flickered to life. You're awake. Harry turned his head. Selwyn stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The hooded figure from before was beside him, now unmasked. Thick scars ran down the man's face. "You should have stayed out of this, Potter," Selwyn said. Harry forced a smirk. "Funny, I was about to tell you the same thing." Selwyn sighed, almost disappointed. "Do you have any idea what's happening in the Ministry? What you're really caught up in?" Harry remained silent. Selwyn stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think you were sent here to spy on me?" "No. They sent you because they knew you'd get too close. You were never meant to survive this." Harry's heartbeat quickened. Was Greaves in on this? Was this all a setup? The scarred man chuckled. "We've got a message for your dear friends at the Ministry. You'll be the one delivering it." Harry tensed. "And if I refuse?" Selwyn smiled. "Then we'll make sure you disappear for real this time." Harry clenched his fists. He wasn't going to let that happen. Harry kept his breathing steady, his mind racing for a plan. His wand was gone, his hands were bound, and the two men in front of him were clearly experienced. Fighting his way out wasn't an option. But he didn't have to, because help was already coming. A loud crack echoed through the air. A split second later, the door burst off its hinges, propelled by a powerful blast. Before Selwyn or his companion could react, Ron and Hermione charged in. Stupefied, Hermione's stunning spell hit the scarred man straight in the chest, sending him crashing into the wall. Ron had his wand aimed at Selwyn. "Step away from Harry, or I swear I'll hex you so badly, your own mother won't recognize you." Selwyn didn't move. Instead, he sneered. How touching. The famous trio, back together again. Harry took his chance. He swung his legs forward, slamming hard into Selwyn's knees. The man stumbled, and in that moment, Hermione flicked her wand. His bindings fell away. Harry lunged for Selwyn, grabbing him by the collar. "What are you hiding?" Selwyn just smirked. "You'll see soon enough, Potter." Before Harry could respond, Selwyn slammed a vial against the floor. A thick cloud of smoke filled the room. By the time it cleared, Selwyn and his remaining ally were gone. Ron helped Harry to his feet. "You all right, mate?" Harry nodded, though his mind was spinning. "Yeah, but we need to move. Now." Hermione frowned. "Why? What did he mean by 'you'll see soon enough'?" Harry clenched his fists. "I don't know. But whatever it is, we're running out of time." Harry, Ron, and Hermione didn't waste time. They knew Selwyn wouldn't have acted alone. Whatever he had been involved in, it was bigger than just him. Back at Grimmauld Place, Hermione spread out every bit of information they had gathered. Newspaper clippings, ministry reports, old court records. Anything that might connect Selwyn to something larger. "Look at this," she said, pointing at a file. After the war, a group of former Death Eaters mysteriously avoided prosecution. Selwyn was one of them. Harry frowned. "We knew some slipped through the cracks, but why would the ministry protect them?" Ron leaned in. "It wasn't protection, mate. It was recruitment." A chill ran through Harry. "They weren't pardoned," Hermione whispered. "They were hired." The realization hit like a hammer. The ministry had secretly absorbed certain Death Eaters into its ranks, using them as spies, informants, and enforcers. Selwyn was part of it. Harry stood abruptly. That means someone high up in the ministry, someone powerful, was in on this from the start. A tense silence filled the room. Then Hermione spoke the name they were all thinking. Kingsley. Harry felt sick. Kingsley had always been a man of honor. But if he had known about this, if he had let this happen... "We need proof," Ron said grimly. They didn't have to wait long. That night, an owl arrived. A single parchment and signed, with just a few words. "Meet me in the Department of Mysteries. Midnight. Come alone." Harry clenched the note in his fist. Looks like we're about to get some answers. At exactly midnight, Harry stepped into the Department of Mysteries. The vast, eerie halls were silent, lit only by dim torches. And there, standing at the center of the Hall of Prophecies, was Kingsley Shacklebolt. "Harry," Kingsley said, his voice heavy. "I was hoping it wouldn't come to this." Harry's grip tightened around his wand. "Tell me the truth. No more lies." Kingsley let out a slow breath. "The ministry is built on secrets, Harry. After the war, we were weak, vulnerable. We had no choice but to use those who once followed Voldemort. We kept them under control, or so we thought." Harry's heart pounded. "And Azkaban? Me? Was I part of that control?" Kingsley looked away. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Selwyn and his people, they turned on us. They saw you as a threat, and I let them push the narrative. I thought I could protect you from the inside. Harry's blood ran cold. You let me rot in Azkaban. For years. I tried to fix it. Kingsley finally met his gaze. But by the time I did, you weren't just a prisoner. You were an enemy of the Ministry. I couldn't undo it without tearing everything apart. Harry felt something inside him break. All those years. The pain. The isolation. And it had all been because of political convenience. Is that what this is about? Harry said, voice shaking. Protecting the Ministry? Not justice. Kingsley didn't answer. Harry exhaled slowly. Then he turned and walked away. Where are you going? Kingsley asked. Harry stopped at the doorway. To do what you should have done years ago. Then, without looking back, he disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, the truth came out. Documents were leaked. Testimonies were given. The wizarding world exploded with the revelation that the Ministry had been using Death Eaters. That Harry Potter's imprisonment had been orchestrated. Kingsley stepped down. Arrests were made. The entire Ministry was thrown into chaos. And Harry, for the first time in years, he was free. But he knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't over. Because if the Ministry could betray him once, it could happen again.